Star Trek Encounters for PlayStation 2, released in October 2006, courtesy of Bethesda and 4J Studios. Encounters was made to sate the Trek fans who were stuck with their PS2 consoles, while Xbox 360 and PC gamers were graced with Star Trek Legacy, a game that I've never played. Actually, PC gamers had plenty of other Star Trek games to choose from, but I digress. Encounters was a budget-level release for the aging second-generation PlayStation, and that's usually the first sign that this isn't going to be as grandioso a Star Trek as one would have hoped to attain. The second sign is the disc that the game is printed on, a PlayStation Blue disc, which denotes a CD-ROM. Generally, PlayStation 2 games are DVD-ROMs, and the only times there have been PlayStation 2 CD games were in the early days of the console. But enough about the doom and gloom, let's go boldly where all have gone before. Star Trek Encounters is a space combat hybrid of arcade shooter and partial simulation-based elements, where you take control of your starship and perform a number of tasks as the situation calls for, whether they'd be seeking out and destroying rogue asteroids, engaging in intense starship combat, defending your space station from asteroids, or flying through rings. You know, like in Superman on N64. Apparently the designers of this game are former Titus employees or something, I don't know. Something. There's a couple main modes of play in Encounters, Skirmish and Episodes. Skirmish is a quick mode where you can engage against enemy ships, whether it be 1-on-1, 3-on-3, or go up against multiple waves of varied enemies. Skirmish is where two players can compete in local split-screen multiplayer, while Episodes is the main campaign mode of Star Trek Encounters, essentially a romp through the various series of Star Trek at the time. When you begin a new file, only the Star Trek Enterprise era is available to play, in which you take command of the NX-01 and go through a number of tutorial scenarios to acclimate yourself to the game's control scheme. As you complete missions, you'll eventually unlock campaigns set in the eras of the original Star Trek, or rather the original movie era of Star Trek to be precise, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and eventually Voyager. And all of this culminates in a final mission where all the various time periods come together and engage in all-out low-budget starship combat, because that's what defines Star Trek at the end of the day. No exploration of the human condition, no boldly going where none have gone before, just a whole bunch of spaceships blowing the shit out of each other without any rhyme or reason to care about any of it.
And then about a decade later, somebody found this game in the archives, played it for a bit, got inspired, and that's how we got Star Trek Discovery. Okay, maybe not, but...
Not to say that it's all about spaceship fisticuffs, as there'll be instances where you have to recover items, escort ships from point A to point B, tractor satellites into orbit, and even race against enemy ships by flying through rings, among other things. But given the rather arcade feel of Encounters, a good majority of the game has you fighting off against enemy spaceships, whether it's part of an offensive strike, or in defense of vital sectors, or some other reason why things blow up in space. Control in Encounters is a very touchy thing here, because they did try to pack in as many aspects of starship operations as they could, and it's a decent effort if nothing else. You use the D-pad to allocate energy to the various systems such as engines, shields, weapons, and sensors. It's not a sophisticated setup, but it does have some minor effects on ship performance. You can cycle through your phasers and photons, deploy mines or tractor beams, or send away teams to sabotage enemy vessels with your transporters. There are those elements which gives Encounters a bit more meat, but at the end of the day, it's still mainly an arcade shooter. Sure, you could target specific ships within your targeting slice and maybe even specific systems, but all it takes is a few concentrated phaser beams to do your opponents in relatively quick fashion. Moving the targeting slice to aim your weapon's fire is an interesting concept on paper, but feels more cumbersome than practical, as it becomes very easy to fumble with the right analog stick to move your slice while trying to press R2 to lock on and pressing R1 to fire. And sometimes this becomes worthless, as your intended target usually flies off screen, thus losing the lock and making you going through the whole process all over again. When you could get it to work, you could target multiple ships at a time, and seeing multiple phaser beams chip away at multiple targets is a satisfying sight indeed. It is actually more trouble than it's worth. More often than not, you'll just aim with the slice and fire away. It works just as well. But it is control over your starship's movement that makes Encounters a particularly iffy experience, even within the realm of arcade-style shooter things. Movement feels extremely floaty. Whether you're controlling the small Defiant-class ship or the much larger Galaxy-class Starship Enterprise, ships seem to move at a ridiculous speed and maneuver with about as much precision and stability as a tricycle caught in a tornado. It never feels like you're truly in control of massive giant capital ships, but rather awkward controlling starfighters or something equally as flimsy. This loose control setup is too much of a hindrance in space combat, but trying to maneuver through warp rings or whatever they're called is an equally frustrating affair. And on top of that, using the left triggers will position your starship to either a higher or lower plane than the base level, usually in order to reach some power-up or touch some warp ring somewhere. It's more complicated than it needs to be, and while the designers can be commended for trying something different, perhaps something simpler and on a single two-dimensional plane would have not only been sufficient, but perhaps even preferable for a more enjoyable experience. In all honesty, I had more fun playing the more straightforward skirmish mode where you're just blowing up starships and nothing else than I did the episode modes, which you do have to play through in order to unlock ships for the aforementioned skirmish mode. When it comes to the missions in the episodes, anything that involves flying through rings and other things, it's a bit spotty at times, and some of the missions feel like chores that you want to be over and done with, rather than anything that gives you a sense of progression and accomplishment. But I suppose it's something that keeps the game varied somewhat, even if the execution isn't quite ideal. The graphics in Star Trek Encounter are fairly decent for a budget title. Given everything is seen from a distance for the majority of the game, one could be forgiven for the somewhat substandard but otherwise serviceable starship models and texture quality. All the starships look like what they're supposed to. You could clearly make out the various Enterprises and Klingons or Borg ships, and all these vessels are somewhat appropriately sized, so you won't have weird cases where a smaller NX-class ship is the same size as a Borg cube or whatever the case may be. The spatial anomaly backdrops like nebulas and the gas giant cloud thing, or whatever it's called, are okay looking. However, points must be docked for the less than helpful sensor frame. This thing with the dots rolling around the edges of the screen. It almost somewhat feels useful at times, but honestly I just prefer a proper radar or map or long-range scanners similar to the next generation games on NES or Game Gear, or practically any simulation game that has a proper radar thing. In regards to sound, well, this is the tricky part. Encounters doesn't have anything in the way of familiar Star Trek themes, which is to be expected. However, the music composed by Jason Graves is enough of a mimicry of the largely wallpaper music of the latter-day pre-Discovery Star Trek spin-offs that it fits in well enough with the largely forgettable music catalog. Aside from a number of Trek-like sound effects that feel that sound decidedly cheap but somewhat Trek-ish, I suppose, Encounters also features narration from William Shatner himself. A fact that the game fails to advertise as a potential selling point, and there's a good reason for that. You see, Mr. Shatner isn't reprising the role he made famous here, but is instead an anonymous narrator merely setting up the story for the episode you're about to play.
After the recent failed invasion, a large Romulan presence remains on the other side of the wormhole.
As such, don't expect greatness from Bill here. He's just coming in to read some narration and pick up a paycheck, and really, who can blame him? This role could have been filled by anybody, and I mean anybody, even the bridge that fell on the captain. Nobody's going to get that.
Star Trek Encounters is difficult to sum up because it was released as a budget title, and sometimes that usually means a game of relatively poor quality and should be approached with tempered expectations. In some cases, however, you could come across a budget title that turns out to be better than you expect, while in other cases you get exactly what you paid for, and Star Trek Encounters falls firmly in the latter category at half impulse. Now that doesn't make it a bad game for what it does, which is offer a somewhat Star Trek-like experience within the confines of down and dirty arcade-like simplicity. Encounters is rather serviceable fare. The combat is somewhat satisfying for the most part. There's an attempt at trying to get as many different types of missions in there as possible to varying degrees of success and failure, and there's enough minutiae to give the game some semblance of depth that's almost virtually non-existent. It's a pretty cheap game these days, so if you just want a little Star Trek game that has you doing some deep space stuff while also providing many explosions, then Encounters might be fun for a lark. But if you want something with a little more substance, well, there's always Starfleet battles. That's always fun.